Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the first semi-annual speaker series from my Men's Group. Our speaker today has graciously agreed to go to all the hot spots in the world and report back to us twice a year. We're very fortunate to have Bob Granholm, who's been in Israel and many, many other places, to be our speaker. We have a huge turnout from the Granholm family. Thank you all for coming. Remember the $4. And since I am not the best person to introduce our speaker, I've asked Jennifer.
All right,
Thank
awesome.
Jennifer
Thank
Granholm,
you very much. I appreciate it.
Ex-Governor of Michigan, ex-Miss San Carlos.
Ex-member, but if you're once a member of Trinity, always a member of Trinity, right?
Yes.
Still coming back.
It's like being in the Marine Corps.
So I have the privilege of introducing my brother Bob. So glad to be here with the full Granholm contingent, including his wonderful daughter Leora, who's his youngest daughter, and of course my great parents, who I know you love. And my great husband, who is also here, Dan Mulhern. So we are here to support Bob. And I know many of you who know Mom and Dad, particularly Mom, know all of Bob's travails, but one of the travails and travels, I'll say. What? Mom, oh, they are? Oh, good. So, Bob, for those of you who don't know, Bob, of course, grew up with us all up and down the California area, but by the time we got here, Bob was launched. He now, in his 61st year, has seen almost every country on the globe, I swear. He was a missionary for many, many years, and it was a missionary on a boat with Operation Mobilization that went to countries all over the world. So he has seen it all. It really created a sense, I think, in him, and he will confirm this, of really being a global citizen. I mean, he's really an amazing soul if you ask him about any place in the world. He just got back, though, as Mike was saying, from having spent a year in Israel, getting his third master's degree, studying at Hebrew University. My brother's a theologian. He has a master's in divinity. He was a chaplain with the Canadian military. He ran a big refugee center when he was in Vancouver. He has done a huge amount of work with people from all over the globe. But his heart, of course, is in his faith, and we like to thank his family as well. So, as his sister, it is a great privilege to be able to introduce you to my wonderful brother, Bob Granholm.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I think I got up. Looks away.
So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the first semi-annual speaker series from my Men's Group. Our speaker today has graciously agreed to go to all the hot spots in the world and report back to us twice a year. We're very fortunate to have Bob Granholm, who's been in Israel and many, many other places, to be our speaker. We have a huge turnout from the Granholm family. Thank you all for coming. Remember the $4. And since I am not the best person to introduce our speaker, I've asked Jennifer.
All right,
Thank
awesome.
Jennifer
Thank
Granholm,
you very much. I appreciate it.
Ex-Governor of Michigan, ex-Miss San Carlos.
Ex-member, but if you're once a member of Trinity, always a member of Trinity, right?
Yes.
Still coming back.
It's like being in the Marine Corps.
So I have the privilege of introducing my brother Bob. So glad to to be here with the full Granholm contingent, including his wonderful daughter Leora, who's his youngest daughter, and of course my great parents, who I know you love. And my great husband, who is also here, Dan Mulhern. So we are here to support Bob. And I know many of you who know Mom and Dad, particularly Mom, know all of Bob's travails, but one of travails and travels, I'll say. What? Mom, get your hearing aids. Oh, they are? Oh, good. So Bob, for those of you who don't know, Bob, of course, grew up with us all up and down the California area, but by the time we got here, Bob was launched. He now, in his 61st year, has seen almost every country on the globe, I swear. He was a missionary for many, many years, and it was a missionary on a boat with Operation Mobilization that went to countries all over the world. So he has seen it all. It really created a sense, I think, in him, and he will confirm this, of really being a global citizen. I mean, he's really an amazing soul if you ask him about any place in the world. He just got back, though, as Mike was saying, from having spent a year in Israel, getting his third master's degree, studying at Hebrew University. My brother's a theologian. He has a master's in divinity. He was a chaplain with the Canadian military. He ran a big refugee center when he was in Vancouver. He has done a huge amount of work with people from all over the globe. But his heart, of course, is in his faith, and we like to thank his family as well. So, as his sister, it is a great privilege to be able to introduce you to my wonderful brother, Bob Granholm.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I think I got up pretty easy. There are many other stories you can tell. And thanks to Mom and Dad for inviting us and for organizing this. The men's team that put on a great breakfast. Trinity is like a home for all of my various iterations of different careers. You guys have been there. You've been supporting me. And my family too, so I appreciate the opportunity to come back and report to you some of my more recent adventures. This is just a group of pictures that I've taken from all over the place. I'm not going to do that travel log today, but what we're going to do is take a peek at my past year, which has been in Israel. And this will be a bit of a travelogue, so we'll talk about Israel. Hopefully that picture comes up here. There we go. And as we do this, we will look at the current political context in Israel. We'll look at some of the security dynamics. We'll look a bit at history. We'll look a bit at religion. And all of those things are required to understand the present-day conflict between Palestinians and Israel, to understand the nation of Israel, and even some of the Middle East. We need to understand all of those things. So history, culture, religion, plus some of what Bob was doing the past year. So this is where I was. I was at Hebrew University doing a Master of Arts in Human Rights and Transitional Justice at the law school. And a lot of people know what human rights is, but a lot of people are asking me, what is transitional justice? Just a quick paragraph. Transitional justice is the type of justice that is used in societies that are transitioning out of authoritarian regimes to more democratic norms. The quintessential kind of paradigm for that is in South Africa, the transition from the apartheid regime to a more pluralistic society. They use methods and mechanisms of transitional justice to enable society to move from one to the other without fracturing and breaking the fabric of society. So that's what transitional justice is. And this was a great place to study it for a couple of reasons. One is that the professorial staff were the guys that wrote the books. And secondly, in this area, these concepts, human rights, transitional justice, international law, are in the front page of the paper every day. So you're living in the midst of these issues as we're studying. just the front entrance to the school. Everything has security, so we had to go through security to get to school. Here is the law school. So, as I said, some of this is the travel. I'll go over that part quickly. In order to appreciate Jerusalem, we need to understand a little bit of the history. So here is, by the way, Mary is with us today. So hi, Mary. She's part of the audience. West Jerusalem, Jerusalem is all of this. West Jerusalem is historic Jerusalem. Before 1967, this was the Israeli-controlled part of Jerusalem. And this was the Jordanian-controlled part of Jerusalem. And this line, this green line, we'll talk a bit about the green line, was the boundary between the Jordanian and the Israeli-controlled area. The exception to that is up here. This is Mount Scopus. This is Hebrew University, part of the Mount of Olive complex. So surrounding the Hebrew University is the West Bank, is East Jerusalem, is Palestinian occupied territory, depending on whose terminology you're using. And we can see that here. So as you look from Hebrew University, as you look north, this first picture up here, you're looking into an Arab village. Now, because this is part of East Jerusalem, which has been annexed by Israel, there's free movement. So all of the Palestinians that live here, they have free access throughout Israel, wherever they want to go. There's public transportation that goes up there. Probably 20% of the population, of the students at Hebrew University are Arabs, and they come from these villages. So this is north. As this is a little bit of a close-up of a little bit further on. One of the oddities, however, is this is the separation wall. We've heard of this barrier that keeps Palestinians out of Israel. On the other side of this village is the separation wall, which includes this apartment complex, which is also part of East Jerusalem. So here we have part of an annexed Israel, East Jerusalem, that is behind the separation wall. It's the only area in Israel where the separation wall cuts through Israel proper. By the way, there's a map here to help us orientate where we are. A bit of a glossary. This is Dan's good idea. And so some of this terminology, the West Bank, the Green Line, is defined there. And we'll be covering this ground as well. But just to help you orientate yourself, the map is useful. So as you're looking east then, this is Mount Scopus again, looking east, the mountains you can barely see in the background are the Jordanian mountains. So the West Bank is not a big area, and as you stand at Mount Scopus, you can easily see Jordan from the campus. As you look south, so that's east, as you look south, you look over again East Jerusalem. So this is all considered by much of the international community to be occupied territories, to the old city. Here are the city walls, the iconic Dome of the Rock, which is a shrine, an Islamic shrine, the third holiest site in Islam, which is where Muslims say that Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's gold because this Temple Mount is managed by the King of Jordan. As a bit of a, he lost Saudi Arabia and the two holiest sites of Islam, so the Israelis gave him the Temple Mount to manage. He sold some property, the King of Jordan sold some property in New York, converted it to gold, and burnished the roof of the shrine in gold. So that's why it's gold. This is not a mosque, this is a shrine. There is a mosque on this side, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa is often in the news, but it's not this site, it's the mosque on the other side of the Temple Mount. The student dorms where the international community lived, and there's a whole lot of international students at Hebrew University, is in a place called French Hill. French Hill is on the other side of the Green Line, so it is technically in occupied territory, and the latest UN resolution has declared that this is all illegally built, and yet it's where the students of Hebrew University live. As you traverse from the student dorms to the actual university, you go by this graveyard. This is the graveyard of British soldiers who died in Palestine. Why would there be British soldiers in Palestine? The answer is because in the aftermath of World War I, the British and the French were given sovereignty over previously the previous sovereign, which was the Turks. The Ottoman Empire ruled all of this territory for 500 years, nearly 500 years. The Turks allied themselves with the Germans in World War I, lost the war, and as a consequence of losing of the war, the Treaty of Survey, they gave much of their holdings to the French mandate, they gave much of their holdings to the British mandate, which included Palestine, what was then the West Bank, or what is now the West Bank, and Jordan. So that's why these British were here. They were here as part of the British mandate, fighting the Turks alongside the Arabs, who saw the Turks as overlords they didn't appreciate, and so they allied themselves with the British. The British armed them, and the British said to the Arabs, if you fight with us against the Turks, when we win, we will give you your own territory, which in fact is what happened, although the territory that the Arabs ended up with was not what they expected. I mean, to put a very complicated story, very simple. The British ruled the area until 1948. In 1948, they left. They gave the matter to the nascent United Nations, which then declared the State of Israel. So up until the foundation of the State of Israel, the British ruled. While the British were ruling, they, after World War I, we're talking about now, and after World War II, they were fighting an Arab revolt. They were fighting the Jews, who were angry at the British for limiting Jewish immigration into Palestine after World War II. The Jews were fighting the Arabs were fighting the Jews, the British were fighting them both, and so all of this conflict was happening up until the foundation to the creation of the State of Israel. Now this is the graveyard where the British soldiers would be buried. And my room at the student dorms. I only stayed there a few months because I was tired of living with a bunch of other guys, having to spend 4 years on a Navy ship. East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is the part of Jerusalem which was under Jordanian control until 1967. In 1967, there was the Second War. There was the War of Independence as soon as the nation of Israel was created. In 1967, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq attacked Israel. They attacked through the West Bank, the Jordanians did. The Israelis repulsed them, took all of the West Bank and annexed East Jerusalem. So by an act of parliament, the Israeli Knesset, they incorporated all of this territory under Israeli sovereignty. Palestinians don't recognize this for the most part. Some do, some don't. The international community doesn't recognize this. Some do, some don't. The UN doesn't recognize this. But nonetheless, it comes under Israeli sovereignty. So these are some pictures of East Jerusalem. One of the most interesting is this one. As you enter the old city going from west to east, you come out the other side of the old city along this wall, and this is what you see. You see 3,500 years of Jewish graves covering a mountain from top to bottom. And this is just probably a third of it. It wraps around the mountain, this massive, gigantic Jewish cemetery that is in the heart of East Jerusalem. When the Israelis were repulsing the Jordanians in the war of 1967, they got to the top of this mountain, which is the Mount of Olives. That was their first conquest. That's what they wanted. They wanted to control the Mount of Olives so that they could get access to their historic graves, 3,500 years of Jewish graves. So this is looking then from the old city up to the Mount of Olives. This is looking from the Mount of Olives down to the old city. So here's that graveyard, looking over the Temple Mount, here the Noble Sanctuary in Arabic, the Dome of the Rock, and into the old city of Jerusalem, the West Jerusalem, then in the background. So this is a typical Arab village in East Jerusalem. that has been there thousands of years. I mean, the Arab community has lived there thousands of years. Yes?
Would that be Golgotha?
No. Golgotha is inside the old city.
Okay.
It's inside a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it would be somewhere kind of in this neighborhood over here. But the Mount of Olives, of course, appears in biblical stories and in many different formats. And there are many churches, which we will see some of them, lining the top of the Mount of Olives. You see all these Russian churches and different kind of churches out there. Che Guevara has his own cafe there in East Jerusalem.
So he gets around.
He gets around. Che Guevara does. Here are some pictures of the old city. So, from the old city, looking up, this is Mount Scopus. This is Hebrew University. So this pocket then, inside the green line, surrounded at 360 degrees by East Jerusalem, visible from the old city. Coming down from the Mount of Olives, through the Jewish graveyard, this is what you see. This is the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate sealed up by the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem 1,500 years ago or so, is the site where Muslims, Christians, and Jews say the Messiah will enter the city of Jerusalem. In fact, it's the gate Jesus used when he is coming from Bethany into Jerusalem. He goes through this gate, now sealed up. And all three faiths say this is the gate the Messiah will enter in through. And it was sealed up because there was a few too many people who thought they were the Messiah going in through that gate. This is just inside this gate, on the top of that is the Dome of the Rock, the El Aqsa Mosque. This site is the site of the ancient Jewish temple. The temple that Herod built, the temple that Solomon built, was up on this platform. The closest the Jews can get to that ancient historic Jewish site is here, the Western Wall. So this wall is at the base of this mount here. This wall, in other words, this would be on top of this. And this is as close to as the Jews can get to pray in the proximity of where the Jewish temple once was. So this is what we call the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. It's divided into two sections, a men's prayer area, a women's prayer area, and this has been a big contention in Israel, and I won't necessarily go into that story, but even here, there's divisions, there's contentions, or there's fights within the Israeli society about what this is about. And by the way, Donald Trump just recently visited Jerusalem. He was the first sitting president who, as president, went to the Wailing Wall. It was his first place to visit. He did the official thing on the tarmac, and then he came here to the Western Wall. So in Israel, they appreciate it. This is Israel of old. So this is where now the Dome of the Rock, where that shrine is, that Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock. This is the Jewish temple that was built by Herod. It was on this platform. So this is the platform that is now host to that Golden Dome and the El Aqsa Mosque. This was the Jewish temple that Herod built, destroyed in 70 AD. Since 70 AD, Jews want to rebuild this temple. And there is today a movement, a significant movement in Israel, to rebuild this temple on the Temple Mount, which would have its own set of problems were that to occur, to put it mildly. One of the interesting things you can do if you visit Israel is go to the Israeli Museum. It's a fantastic museum. One of the things they have there is this scale replica of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago. So you walk around this, you see how the city was laid out, where the city walls were, and how prominent a structure this was. It really was the center of Jewish life. It was the center of Jerusalem life. It occupied a significant chunk of Jerusalem real estate in those days, and is still contested.
Is that a photograph?
This is a photograph of this. So I stood in front of this and did a close-up, and that's what that looks like. But this is, of course, a replica. Yeah. It's a replica based on archaeological evidence, based on eyewitness testimonies, which are not so hard to find in the Roman from the Roman era, including Josephus and others. The access up here was via this. And today, all that's left is, this is all gone, this wall is left, and there's just this remnant up here. The Wailing Wall, where Jews pray, is right down here. This wall was built by King Herod, this massive structure, one of the recent archaeological innovations, I guess you could say, of the Israeli sovereignty, is to dig tunnels. They've dug tunnels to the base of this. And now they do tours where you can walk the entire length on the other side from here to here underground along the base of the wall. And you see these massive stones as wide as this room that Herod placed over 2,000 years ago. He was a massive builder and a great engineer, or had a great engineering team that was able to construct these kinds of things. The old city has a number of gates. This is north towards East Jerusalem towards West Jerusalem, and each of these gates has its own flavor. This is Damascus Gate. This is looking into the Arab quarter. So here's this Arab gentleman who refused to look at me, to have his picture taken, selling vegetables. Some Palestinian girls just hanging out at the Damascus Gate. This is the Jaffa Gate in preparation for Trump's visit. They shut the whole thing down. Some of the old city gates. The city walls are a remnant of the Ottoman Empire. Really, it was Suleiman, about 14th century, that built the walls as they are today. So it continually was expanding and shifting the actual walled area. But the walls of today date from Suleiman, the Turkish ruler in the 14th and the 15th century.
Where's the gate that's blocked off?
Often this gate, so here the eastern gate is the one that is sealed off. When you hear of trouble in the old city, it is usually either in Damascus Gate or Lions Gate, because this is the proximity to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When Muslims want to come to pray, they come through the Damascus Gate or the Lions Gate to access the mosque. And so that's often where the conflicts occur. West Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, largely Palestinian, not 100%, but largely. And by the way, amongst the Palestinians of East Jerusalem, probably about 7 to 8% are Arab Palestinian Christians, of which, and particularly in the Damascus Gate area, is a large Arab Christian community down there. In West Jerusalem, we have the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. The Israeli parliamentary system and the electoral system is the most representative system in the world. Because of the unique nature of how they elect people, it's one electoral district. They don't elect individuals, they elect a list. And there's 15 different parties that you can vote for. And if party A gets 5% of the vote, then they get 5% of the 5% of the representation in the Knesset. And so they'll just go down the list. Number 1, 2, 3, you're in because that equals our 5%. As a result of this, it is a very fractured political environment. And in order to govern, you need to form coalition. The Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of the prime minister, is prime minister because he has formed coalitions on the right. And the biggest influence in his government are the ultra-Orthodox Jews. The ultra-Orthodox Jews are a very unique situation. They are the fastest growing population in the Middle East. The average woman has 8 kids. Whoa! And because of this, they're growing in size, dramatically growing in size. And because of the increase of population, their electoral representation in the Knesset increases. And it is these guys, the ultra-Orthodox, that is one of the primary problems in the whole peace process. Because they are hardline against negotiating territorial concessions. They claim the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which historically is accurate. It is Judea and Samaria. But what they mean by that is this is also Israel. So they're claiming all of the land as belonging to Israel. And because of that influence in the government of Israel and the requirement to build coalition with the religious parties, and there's a few of them, is one of the dynamics in Israel today which is inhibiting a potential for peace.
Bob, is it 8 children a political thing or is it a religious
It
thing?
was a religious thing. I mean, it's kind of like the pre-Vatican Catholics, where birth control is not part of the agenda. A woman's role is to have as many kids as possible. And there's a lot of problems in this community. Won't go into that necessarily, but yeah. West Jerusalem is connected to East Jerusalem via this train. It's a fantastic, it's called the light rail. It's what I would hop on every morning to go up to the university. It goes past the university to that Arab village on the other side, and then all the way through Jerusalem to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial on Mount Herzl. So it's a great public transportation system. At nighttime, this road looks like this. Awesome. It just becomes a big party scene. It's unbelievable, with music everywhere. And this is not just some kind of lowbrow musician. These guys are like, they can play in the Philharmonic. I mean, they are brilliant musicians that just populate the street and just go at it. It's really quite remarkable. The arts and culture of Jerusalem is a very vibrant thing. It surprised me. I did not expect that there, but they're good, I must say.
Is that sponsored by the government?
No, it's just the individuals say, I want to go play my violin on the street. So away they go. Yeah. This is the big market in Jerusalem. It's probably about 5 or 6 city blocks. You can buy anything you want here. This was my morning breakfast hangout. I think Jennifer took this picture or something like that anyways, when she was there. About half of these stores are run by Palestinians. Every day, 200,000 Palestinians come from the West Bank into Israel for work. A lot of them drive trucks, a lot of them work in the construction industry, a lot of them run shops in places like this market. The West Bank. The West Bank then is the area that Israel occupies but does not have sovereignty over. Israel does not claim sovereignty over the West Bank, but it occupies it. Thus, it is subject to the Fourth Geneva Convention and the rules of occupation in managing the global populations, etc., etc. This is Ramallah. Ramallah is the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is the government of the Palestinian people. It includes Fatah, which is more or less in control of the West Bank, and Hamas, which is more or less in control of Gaza. Both of them come under the Palestinian Authority umbrella. So the PA is an umbrella organization which has many different actual parties. There's about 7 or 8 of them in the Palestinian Legislative Council, but the dominant one is Fatah in the West Bank, Hamas in Gaza. And as you can see, I mean, people are actually doing okay. I mean, you walk through the West Bank, and I'm all around the West Bank, and it's not like, you tend to think of people living in poverty or whatever. You do have some of that, of course, but you also have, I mean, most people get along, okay. One of the interesting things to note in this picture is that the fruit and vegetables all come from Israel.
All come from
Israel. So these are all Israeli-produced goods that are then imported into the West Bank. And the things are a lot cheaper here. So I prefer to buy my stuff in the West Bank because it's not subject to Israeli taxes. And so it's cheaper. This is some kids in Hebron. We'll take a look at Hebron here in a second. Hebron is the largest city in the West Bank. But this is what much of the West Bank looks like. This is actually taken from Jericho. There's a monastery way up in the hills. But much of the West Bank looks like this. It's rugged, hilly, infertile, desolate land. And then you have the occupation. One of the primary features of the occupation are these checkpoints. Palestinians that work in Israel have to go through these checkpoints. And it's like going into a prison. You might ask, how do I know what going into a prison is like? I won't answer that question, but it's like going into a prison. You walk up these cement barriers and around the corner, and your soldiers, Israeli soldiers, IDF, the Israeli Defense Force soldiers with their semi-automatic weapons are everywhere, and your papers are checked, and then you're allowed into Israel. So it's a very intimidating and humiliating process, and yet hundreds of thousands do this daily because they prefer to work in Israel. You get paid more in Israel, the employers are more reliable in Israel, and so it's a major backbone of the Palestinian economy is the Palestinians that work in Israel. Because of the terrorism that was emanating from the West Bank into Israel, the Israelis decided, okay, we've got to solve this problem. So they built this wall. This massive wall that cuts off the Arab community from Israel. Before this, there was, pretty open access. But about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more now, this wall was built, and this is Bethlehem. And this is what used to be the main street in Bethlehem. It used to be the commercial center. Two-way traffic, all kinds of shops, bisected by this massive
It's
wall.
like about 30 feet, isn't it?
Oh, I don't know how tall it is, but it's unscalable. And then on the top is barbed wire, and there's lights, and there's Israeli posts all along. So it's this, and the wall is all, apart from that one section I showed you, is all in the West Bank. So the West Bank itself is divided by this wall. This is Hebron. Hebron, the largest Palestinian city, is also home to a historic Jewish community that's been there hundreds of years. More than that. Hebron is the site of the burial grounds of Abraham and Sarah, which is revered, of course, by both Muslim and Jews. And so the site, I have a picture elsewhere, I didn't put it here. The site of the burial of Abraham and Sarah is also bisected. One part of it's a mosque, the other part of it is a synagogue. So there is this ancient Jewish presence in Hebron. In the later negotiations of the Oslo Accords, what the Palestinians and Israelis decided to do was divide Hebron into H1 and H2. Part of Hebron would be controlled by Israel, the other part would be controlled by the Palestinian Authority. So about 15% of Hebron is controlled by the Israelis, and that's where the Jewish presence is. Of course, there are many Muslims there as well, but because of the hostility between the Palestinians and the Jews in Hebron, Israel shut down the market. So this used to also be a vibrant market, like the one we saw in Ramallah, now a ghost place. Because up here is where the Jews live. Part of the difficulties and dynamics. This is the map you have. I won't spend too much time on this. Just note that how far Jerusalem extends into the West Bank. So Israel, at its narrowest, is like 12 miles across. And one of the reasons for the occupation of the West Bank is the Jews, again, fear that they would be cut off by a military intervention, like 3 times has been tried from Jordan. Now, Israel now has a peace treaty with Jordan. Israel now has a peace treaty with Egypt. And in that peace treaty, they gave back the Sinai to Egypt. They have evacuated Gaza. There's no longer IDF presence in Gaza itself. But the West Bank and the Golan continue to be occupied by Israel. The Golan, like East Jerusalem, has been annexed. So in 1984, the Knesset passed a bill which said that the Golan Heights, which the international community says belongs to Syria, is now coming under Israeli sovereignty, which is illegal under international law. And as the notes here mentioned, I gave you some reference for some of the international documents that say that acquisition of territory by force is illegal under international law. So nobody in the world, apart from Israel, recognizes the annexation of the Golan Heights, except for the people that live there. The Druze, who are the inhabitants of the Golan, prefer Israeli sovereignty. I think probably anybody would prefer Israeli sovereignty to Syrian sovereignty these days. But in international law, the wishes of the local population don't really count for much. Yeah,
Yeah, I was there in 1964.
in the Golan?
Yeah, well, in Israel, and we've done all the Arab countries first, and then Israel was the last. And you could see Syrian tanks sitting up there on the Golan Heights. And that's one of the reasons I think Israel's never going
I don't think
to
it.
get it back.
Yeah, I mean, they're too deeply embedded up there. And you're right, the Golan Heights is a big escarpment that looks over the valley below. And if you control that, then you can lob missiles and whatever into the valley below, which is exactly what the Syrians were doing. And again, 3 times Israel is attacked through the Golan, and so for security purposes, they've occupied it and annexed it. So, in 1993, a series of agreements between Palestinians and the Israelis were finally agreed upon. This is the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords divide the West Bank into 3 zones. Zone A, which is where the Palestinian population lives, under full Palestinian control, including security. As you travel through the West Bank, you come across these signs, which in English says, "This road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against the Israeli law." So all these signs are all throughout the West Bank. This particular sign is taken as I was entering Jericho. So that is Area A. Area B is where the Palestinian Authority has control, but the Israelis provide the security. Area C is full Israeli control, which is 60% of the West Bank. Area C is also what in the Turkish era, remember the Turks ruled this area for almost 500 years, they called Area C wasteland, because this is also the desolate regions, inhospitable, not good for agriculture, and so that's also a feature of Area C. And Area C is where the Jewish settlers live. If I go back, this is an example of a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. Nice paved roads that go directly into the state of Israel. They don't go through the checkpoints. Palestinians can't use these roads unless they have special permits on their car, which very, very few do. So you have within the West Bank 500,000 Jews living in settlements like this with their own road network leading to Israel throughout this Area C. Area C, however, by agreement, under the Oslo Accords, is ruled by the IDF. So this is also part of the occupied territory where the IDF, the Israeli Defense Fund, Israeli Defense Force, runs the show. Now, looking at this map, you can see the difficulty. On one hand, the settlers that are mostly closer to the Israeli border are not taking Palestinian private territory. They're not occupying private Palestinian land because Palestinians don't own land here. And when the settlers do encroach on something that even seems like it's owned by Palestinians, the Israeli Supreme Court has ordered that demolished. But on the other hand, how do you build a country that looks like Swiss cheese? It's untenable. And this is one of the difficulties in the region, is these 500,000 settlers that are all throughout this white area that make the idea of a contiguous Palestinian state very difficult to achieve. When the Israelis left Gaza, they evacuated 20,000 settlers, and that was a national trauma. It would be impossible to remove 500,000 Israelis from the West Bank settlements. And most of those settlers, but I'd say slightly over 50%, are religious Zionists who are moving into the area and saying, this is all Israel. And so there's the ideological component. Some of them are moving because the real estate's cheaper and it's, Israel's an expensive place. But a lot of them are moving because of ideological reasons. They feel like this is their God-given land and they're not about to be removed except by force. So it's one of the difficult dynamics of the region. Okay, a little bit more about the Green Line in 1967. This is the Green Line. This is the area between Israeli troops and Jordanian troops after the War of Independence in 1948 until 1947. So all this, 1967, thank you. All of this was in Jordanian control. And the area where you saw that train in the private picture looked like this. This is the same road. This is Jaffa Street. And as a matter of fact, that's what this looked like. It wasn't just a line on a map. It was this. And there was only one way to get from West Jerusalem to East Jerusalem, through Mandelbaum Gate. Mandelbaum Gate was here, and it was the only way for Israelis to get up to this area inside the Green Line, which is Mount Scopus or Hebrew University. So once a week, a convoy would travel through the Mandelbaum Gate up to Mount Scopus for resupply. Today, this is the remnant. This is the train which follows pretty much the Green Line, at least in that section. This is the commemoration to Mandelbaum Gate. So it's all open now, and people go through this all the time. But this was back until Israel conquers the West Bank and annexes up to here. So this is now Jerusalem. But this is the Palestinian area of East Jerusalem, considered occupied territory. So a little bit more traveling the country. So this is the Dead Sea area. Masada, the famous Roman fort that after the destruction of Jerusalem in 1970, many Jews fled up there as kind of the last refuge against the Roman heavy-handed destruction of the Jewish people. And the inhabitants of Masada decided to commit mass suicide rather than be subject to Roman rule. And it is now a place where IDF soldiers, one of the places, where IDF soldiers will go to take their oath of allegiance on entering the IDF. The Dead Sea looks like this. It's this inhospitable, harsh, brutal desert land, with a couple exceptions. As you walk up this valley, about 4 or 5 kms, you come to this. This is En-Gedi, which is also a biblical story, where David approaches Saul and says, "Hey man, I could have killed you, here's a bit of your clothes." Then Saul repents of his persecution of David for a while anyways. And the reason that this can be lush and green is because as you hike up this valley, there is this water that is gushing out of the mountains. It is so just incongruous because you're walking through this hot desert area and all of a sudden water is pouring out of the mountain. Where is this water coming from? Rain? Snow? I've never seen snow. It's coming from underground. There are these geographical aquifers that are pushing water up and gushing it out of the mountains in places like En-Gedi and Jerusalem. Why is Jerusalem able to settle? Because of the water which squirts up out of the ground in an Arab village called Silwan, or the ancient city of David. And that's another story. But it's because of these geological formations that people are able to live in a place like Jerusalem. Now, Israel gets its water from many sources these days, but that's how they got their water then. And that's why En-Gedi is in the Bible, is because of this water that's coming out of the rocks. I don't know who that is, she just happened to get annoyed. Much of Israel is desert. So as you go down south, you go to the Negev. The Negev is this vast desert that ends up in Eilat, which is a beach resort. But you're traveling through this kind of territory. The puppet Ibex here seems rather unconcerned by me taking this picture. Here is a Bedouin village. In the Negev, about 4% of the land is claimed by the Bedouin. The Bedouin are nomadic Arab tribes people who were in this land again for a long, long time. Israel wants to move these villages and get people living in cities where they can provide education and healthcare and services. These guys say, no, we're not going to do that. We're happy where we are. So part of the tension in Israel is between the Bedouins and the Israelis. The Israelis want to move them. The Bedouins don't want to be moved. Sometimes the Israelis go into these communities and level a house or two just to make their exclamation point. But these guys aren't moving. So part of the tension. Traveling the country in the north, the Golan. This is the Golan here. It's a bit hazy today, but you're looking down over the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias would be right over here. So this would be all exposed from the Golan. This is up in the Golan too. It's a beautiful, lush area, now controlled by Israel. In the north is this city, Safed. Safed is the center of Jewish mysticism. So you probably heard about the Kabbalah. Madonna was into Kabbalah for a while. The center of historic Kabbalah Jewish mysticism is this city of Safed, which has been there for 2,000 years in the north of Israel. By the way, a lot of these pictures, I took all these pictures, a lot of them were published in the Jerusalem Post. And some of them have been produced on cards that I carry around sometimes. So, more just kind of travel stuff. Tel Aviv, the Mediterranean, beautiful beaches of Israel. Haifa, this is French warship, the main port. Israel has these fantastic caves. So this is near Jerusalem, this stalactite cave. You can walk through it. Here's that walkway. But a couple kms perhaps of these beautiful, beautiful formations. This is Latrun. Latrun is on the way from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, getting up into the mountains. This used to look like what the Negev looks like today. One of the amazing things that the Israelis have done is made the desert blue. And it's a pretty phenomenal thing. Israelis are some of the world leaders in agricultural technology, including water use, irrigation technology, and it's actually become quite a high-tech, innovative society these days, and not just in the agricultural area, but in many other areas as well. But this is a vineyard from a monastery in Latrun, just to give you an idea of how lush the land has become. A few random shots. Here's the IDF. Every young person in Israel must serve in the Israeli Defense Force unless you're ultra-Orthodox. If you're ultra-Orthodox, you're exempt from military service, and you study Torah until you're 40 years old. So now Israel has hundreds of thousands of guys studying Torah, not working, not serving in the military, getting government subsidy, and much of the rest of the country is getting a little ticked off and subsidizing these guys who are really unproductive and creating political problems for the rest of the country. But in any event, the IDF. This is the world's most advanced tank, the Merkava 4, crewed by young women like this. Israelis are very quick to display the flag and have a lot of pride in their Israeli citizenship and heritage. And of course, we're familiar with the Holocaust story, we're familiar with, movies like The Exodus and books like The Exodus, and Israelis feel that on a daily basis. They feel like they are a people redeemed from destruction, surrounded by enemies, and their prosperity is a thing of pride for Israelis. And you really get that sense when you're there in the country. Israel has flowers. And this is where I live. My two grandkids, my oldest daughters. Okay, so let's conclude here by a few observations. We've kind of covered some security issues, but what are the obstacles to peace in the area? Both societies are divided along religious lines. We've described that in the Israeli context. It's also true in the Palestinian context. Although most Palestinians are not very Islamic. You know, they go through the forms, but they're not terribly committed. Nonetheless, there is a significant element within Palestinian society that uses religion as a means of justifying their claims to the land. And part of the problem is that both religious claims are rooted in history. So how do you reconcile mutually irreconcilable religious claims? The answer is you don't. And the side with the most guns and the biggest tanks sets the agenda. And that's exactly what's happening here. Corruption in the Palestinian Authority is listed by Palestinians as the biggest issue they face. The Palestinian Center for Survey Research, I forget what that piece stands for, in July of this year did a survey. And in their survey, this was one of their bottom lines. The most serious problem, this was asking Palestinians, done by Palestinians. The most serious problem confronting Palestinian society today is the spread of corruption in public institutions in the eyes of 28% of the public, while 24% believe it's poverty and unemployment, and 22% it's the continuation of occupation and settlement activities. So in other words, when you ask Palestinians, what is the biggest problem? The number one problem that they address is their corrupt leadership. And I heard this wherever I went in the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, was elected in 2006 for a 4-year term. There have never been any other elections. The Palestinian Legislative Council was elected at the same time. They have never once sat. Imagine a legislative council elected by the people that has never once sat, never passed one law, and the party that won the most seats in the Legislative Assembly in that election was not asked to form the government, but the party that won the second most seats was asked by Abbas to form the government. It's a crazy system that simply doesn't work. And in fact, we have two governments. We have the Fatah government in the West Bank ruling by presidential decree without any recourse to the Legislative Assembly, and Hamas ruling by legislative decree in Gaza, claiming to be the representative of all the Palestinian people without recourse to the Palestinian Legislative Assembly. So it is a mess, and most Palestinians are dead set against the present iteration of the Palestinian Authority, and they identify that kind of corruption. They see these guys who get all this international money building their beautiful houses on the hill, while the average people has bad roads and bad education and suffers from health problems. You know, this health system is weak. So, anyways, and then you have the growth of the Jewish settlements. We've talked about that, and the ideology of the settlers, which is probably a bigger problem. The ideology of the settlers, which says this all belongs to us, and we're not.
Didn't one of those groups cut off utilities to the other one recently?
Yes. So Fatah said, because they collect money for both Gaza and PA and West Bank, they said, we're going to stop paying for your electricity. Israel supplies the electricity to Gaza, but the Palestinians pay for it. They pay a subsidized rate. Palestinian Authority said, we're going to stop paying the salaries of the Hamas politicians in Gaza, and we're going to stop paying your electricity. Israel continues to provide the electricity, but Palestinian Authority, what they want, what the PA wants, what Abbas wants, is for the people of Gaza to recognize Fatah leadership. That's what they want. So they're trying to put pressure on the people to not recognize the Hamas leadership that's in Gaza, but to recognize the Fatah leadership that's in the West Bank. In the Gaza, they also have problems with Egypt. Egypt has shut down the border more than Israel has, because much of Gaza borders Egypt. So Gaza is caught in this vice. What is my opinion of probable outcome of things 5 years hence? I don't want to look beyond 5 years. I'd say the most likely scenario is the continuation of the status quo. The only people that can really change the status quo are the Israelis. And the alternatives to the status quo for the Israelis do not seem very powerful. Israel has the weapons, Israel has the guns, Israel has the strength, and they can keep the status quo. For the Palestinians, as time goes on, their situation deteriorates. if they had accepted, the Oslo Accords, they would be doing fine. But they have rejected each and every opportunity for settlement because their demands are not possible for Israel to give in. So the status quo, I think, is the most likely scenario going forward. Another potential is that Israel would simply annex part of the West Bank, where most of the settlements are, and just withdraw and say, okay, you're on your own. And I give that a 20% chance. Israeli sovereignty over the entire West Bank. That's a possibility. One of the really surprising things that I heard when I was in Israel was Palestinian leadership coming from the West Bank. I mean tribal leadership, and saying to the Israeli government, why have you saddled us with this corrupt government? You come and rule over us. And I've heard that from young people too. Okay, Israel, you want the area, you take it. But then you give us good health care, access to education, good jobs, and we'll come under your sovereignty. It's better than what we have right now. So this is an increasing sentiment amongst Palestinians who they would prefer some Israeli sovereignty to Palestinian authority. A two-state solution as per Oslo, the dynamics for that are diminishing as time goes on. They're diminishing because of the political context in both countries. They're diminishing because the demands of the Palestinian for negotiations are simply not attainable, as at least as per the demands in Oslo. But there's another dynamic that's happening. The Arab nations around are more closely aligning with Israel and beginning to abandon the Palestinians, who feel that acutely. Why would that be the case? A couple of reasons. 10 years ago, was it 10 years ago? Something like that. The Arab League came up with its own peace plan, the Arab Peace Initiative, which said, we will officially recognize the state of Israel and establish normal diplomatic relations with all the Arab nations. Will do that if Israel enters into negotiations with the Palestinians based on certain conditions, which are the Palestinian conditions, a return, 1967 Green Line as the international border, the right of return, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians going back to the villages from which they were made refugees from in the War of Independence, and East Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That's the Palestinian basic negotiating demand. But what the Arab Peace Initiative also did is said, we will set up separate tracks to negotiate each of these. So in other words, that's kind of the starting point of negotiation, but when the Israelis said, that's great, we'll enter these negotiations, we'll enter these tracks. The Palestinians said, no, no, no. So again, the Arab world feels like the Palestinians are not listening to them. There needs to be compromise. So there's an abandonment of an increasing, it's not total, an increasing abandonment of the Palestinian cause by the Arab world, an increasing alliance with Israel, because Israel is seen as a bulwark to the Sunni Arabs against the Shia hegemony that's happening in the region. And Israel's main enemies, of course, are Hezbollah and Syrian government, which are part of this Shia hegemony emanating from Iran that the Sunni states are worried about. So they see Israel as an ally to them. So these are part of the dynamics that are shaping this conflict as well. Okay, I think that's enough. Do we have time for some questions and answers or comments? What do you think? How much time do we have here? Sure, okay. Yeah.
Do you have like a good general layman's history book or two that you could recommend for the reading interest, influence that way?
I was just in Barnes & Noble with Jennifer Lear the other day, and in their world history section, there was a big top shelf of books. I'm reading a book right now, it's called The Lemon Tree. And it's the story of a Palestinian family who were evacuated, who were made refugees from their village in the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, fled to Ramallah, European Jews that were fleeing Nazi encroachment in Bulgaria come into Israel and were given this home of this Palestinian family that's now in Ramallah. So these kids of this refugee story come back to their ancient home, to the home in which they were born and raised. And they begin a dialogue with the current owner. And it's a good book. It's called The Lemon Tree, because it tells the history of both. And in order to really understand the context, you need to understand what was propelling Jews into Israel. You need to understand the Palestinian connection with the land. And this story does that in a very personal and engaging way. It's not a novel, it's a true story, but it provides some important historical context. So there's one book.
What's the Jewish population of the West Bank
500,000
compared to the Palestinians?
to 2.6 million.
And what's the citizenship status of Palestinians in
They
Israel?
have no citizenship.
No citizenship.
The Palestinians of the West Bank have no citizenship because it was occupied by Jordan. But Jordan didn't give them citizenship. Occupied by Israel, but Israel was not going to give the Palestinians citizenship, so they have no citizenship.
How about citizenship in Israel?
There 20% of the Israeli population are Arab Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, vote members into the Knesset. The second official language of Israel is Arabic. The Arabs of Israel have their own school system. They have complete access before the law to all of Israel. Now, having said that, there's a social, cultural dynamic which makes them feel like they're second-class citizens, and there's reality there. But legally and politically, they have every right that any other Israeli citizen would have. That's 20% of the population. The inhabitants of East Jerusalem have Israeli identity cards and can apply for Israeli citizenship, but not many have. Nonetheless, with their identity cards, they pay taxes, they can go to the hospital, they have education, they can go anywhere in Israel and work. So there's various classes of citizenships.
When you were talking about the West Bank, you very carefully added in that the Israelis were in violation of international law. But if I was an Israeli, I would argue, well, when the Ottomans took it, did they follow international law?
Here's the Israeli argument. The Geneva Conventions, upon which this argument is predicated, was created in a time of sovereign nations. So if Germany takes Poland, that's an illegal occupation because one sovereign is taking the territory of another sovereign. But what about in a situation like the West Bank when there is no other sovereign? Israel didn't take the West Bank from anybody, from another sovereign people. There was no sovereign nation. So Israel says, we will apply the rules of belligerent occupation as per Geneva Convention 4 and the Associated Protocol 1, but we don't call this occupied territory, we call it disputed territory. Because under the Geneva Convention definitions of occupation, it's you're occupying another sovereign entity, which is not the case in the West Bank, because there was no prior sovereign. Or the prior sovereign, Turkey, collapsed and gave it all to the British. Gave that area to the British. By the way, in the British Mandate, this is where the Balfour Declaration comes into play. Under the British Mandate, the British government said, we will allow this mandatory area in Palestine to become the homeland of the Jewish people as long as they respect the culture and history of the Arab peoples. It was never conceived that there would be an independent state in those days. It was just a homeland for the Jewish people where they could live on their own in cooperation with everybody else that lives there. In 1947, the United Nations said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to partition the land. And so they came up with this partition plan, which created a small Jewish state and a much larger Arab state on the land. The Israelis rejoiced over this, and by the way, it's much, much smaller than the state of Israel. what was given to the Jews in the partition plan. The Arabs rejected it. Thus the creation of the state of Israel. Yeah.
Brother Bob, so now giving a different perspective and all your report and what you show, what's happening with Palestine and Israelis is the promise of God to Rebecca says in Genesis 25:33, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people shall divide from your bowls. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. What is your opinion?
My opinion is this, is that it's impossible to utilize ancient religious texts to solve modern political issues.
That's true.
You know, because if you go down that road, then how do you say that claim is more valid than the Islamic claim or anybody else's claim? So, you know, I think you have to put religion on the shelf when you're negotiating and enter into real negotiations with real people about real issues in today without recourse to ancient historical texts. But this is one of the big problems in Israel, is that there's a significant section of the Israeli community that wants to base the political entity of Israel on historic claims. And one guy told me, actually, we don't own the West Bank, we own from the Euphrates to the Nile. I was like, okay, good luck with that. You know, it becomes a point where it just becomes politically impossible. So you have to deal with what's possible. And sometimes these religious elements make it far more difficult to come to any kind of meaningful accommodation. So,
And yet the Orthodox is the growing population,
absolutely,
both physical and political.
that's correct. And the one is because of the other. Yes. And Israel is a society that is being pulled at the seams itself. So not only do you have a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you have an inter-Israeli tensions, and you have inter-Palestinian tensions, intra-Palestinian tensions. So it's a confusement. Yeah.
With Israel being so prosperous and innovative, do we really need to give them aid? We give them a lot of money.
Well, that's true, we do. I'd say probably not, although one caveat to that is the money that the, let's say, U.S. government gives to Israel is to purchase U.S. weaponry. So in fact, you're supporting American industry when you do that. But yeah, does Israel need the kind of subsidies? You know, you're still talking about a population of 8 million, surrounded by 40 million Arabs that have more or less committed to their destruction, although that's not quite true, because Egypt and Jordan, even though there's hostilities there, signed peace treaties, as has Lebanon. So, you know, that's a good question, and I think one that should be discussed. But you raise another point, which I'd like to just briefly mention, the innovative nature of Israeli society. You know, in these obstacles to peace, perhaps I should also comment on some positive elements that are happening. And one of them is what's happening amongst young entrepreneurs, Israeli entrepreneurs, who want to encourage the Palestinian economy. So there are Israeli entrepreneurs that choose to establish their companies in the West Bank, to employ Palestinians. I mean, there's economic reasons for that too, but to train a generation of young Palestinians in entrepreneurial IT mentality. And so where we're seeing some things happen is not in the political arena. It's amongst young people who are saying, let's figure something else out. This ain't working. And so they're using, you know, economic cooperation and NGO cooperation, and there's a lot of Israeli organizations that are partnered with Palestinian organizations just to do some basic things. Okay, thank you. So on a grassroots level, there are initiatives that are encouraging. It's not reflected yet in the political realm. When these guys come into their political own, and all the 70-year-old guys, you know, lead politics, things might be able to change, which is why I have a 5-year horizon on this. Jennifer mentioned something that's also important. In the Palestinian population, I'm talking about with the West Bank, it is one of the most educated populations in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, in the West Bank, it's the only area of the Arab world where women outnumber men in higher education. So here you also have this generation, this young generation, and many of them were up at Hebrew University. Many Palestinian women were up there, including one blind Palestinian woman that I would read to the course material, and we got to be friends and heard her story. The upcoming generation of educated Palestinian women will change the dynamics once they get into positions of power. So that's another hopeful element. It's amongst the young people who are saying, this ain't working, and it's the young people who are also saying, okay, Israel, come and rule over us, that's okay. Just give us access to everything that we see in Israel. And men don't really care about kind of the historic grievances. And that's one of the things that transitional justice brings to the table. Because if you live in your historic grievance, it makes it so much more difficult to come to some conclusions. You have to be able to say, that happened, it was wrong, we were aggrieved, but moving forward, we're not going to live there. And that's beginning to happen again amongst the
If that were to happen, that they would accept the Palestinian, the Israeli rule over them, wouldn't that also mean they'd be giving up a chance to participate in governing themselves?
Well, the kind of model that's being talked about is like a Quebec model, where Quebec is giving a huge amount of sovereignty within a confederated system. So it's like Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Kurdistan has its own parliament, its own flag, its own government, its own economy, but it's all under an Israeli federated system. So if Israel became a federated society, like think back to the original 13 colonies of the US, where each state had its own significant economy, something like that, where Palestinians are given a high degree of autonomy, but yet are loyal to the federal state, might have some traction. Might have some traction. Lots of caveats.
Do you see any signs or hear language of people who are obviously worshiping God and seeking to do His will?
Oh, believe me, everybody is religious in Jerusalem.
No, I didn't ask that question.
Everybody thinks they're doing the will of God is the thing. I mean, these religious Zionists that are moving into the West Bank are saying, this is God's will. God gave us this 3,000 years ago. Here, read about it. Muslims will say, God has given us this land, and there's no way, this is where Muhammad ascended into heaven, there's no way we're ever going to relinquish our claims. Christians don't have territorial claims. But, they're also there, and fighting with one another for things like, who's going to sing the loudest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? It gets nuts. But what you're asking is, are there people there that are committed to kind of a biblical notion of reconciliation? The answer is yes, there is. But it's again the young people. One of my friends there is a female Jewish rabbi, which is pretty uncommon in Israel. And she is part of all kinds of initiatives that bring Palestinians and Israelis together to talk about their issues, to normalize one another. So there are all kinds of religious things happening as well in that regard. When that percolates up to the political level, we might see some actual forward progress. But right now, it's all kind of percolating under the radar on the ground.
Tom Friedman, if any of you read him in the New York Times, he's obviously studied this a long period of time from a lot of his writings. But he talks about these three sort of pillars. One is that Israel has always seen itself as a democratic state, meaning democracy is super important. Many in Israel have wanted all the land, is the second. And third is Israel has always seen itself as a Jewish state. And his point is you cannot have all three. You could have a democratic state, which means giving a democratic state in all the land, but that means you give the vote to the Palestinians, and therefore you won't be a Jewish state, right? You can have a Jewish state, but you can't have all the land. So you have to give up one of those three pillars in order for there to be some resolution to this.
By the way, the Israeli Declaration of Independence and the basic laws which form the Constitution say that Israel is a democratic and Jewish state. So that Jewish stateness is embedded into the foundational documents of the state of Israel. A hard one for Israel to be able to get. Yes.
Presbyterian Church puts forward things called overtures, and there's been any number of them recently about we should divest from companies that support the Israelis, but the most telling one, and it's gotten a lot of votes, is that Israel is guilty of apartheid. Take that. And it hasn't passed yet, but they're saying that the treatment of the Israelis toward Palestinians is very close to what it was in South Africa.
I think that's completely fallacious. With, in Israel, the Arab Israelis have equal access to food. The East Jerusalemite Palestinians have equal access. The school that I attended was 15 to 20% Arab Palestinian. There was no segregation. They were sitting together. Where you do see traces that may hint at something like that is in the occupation. So I think you need to distinguish between the Palestinians that are citizens or in East Jerusalem than those that are occupied. And so you do have kind of separate roads for Israelis, and you do have Jewish settlements and Palestinian villages, but I wouldn't call it a policy of the government based on racial inferiority, kind of ideology. That is not part of the equation. And the reason for some of the harsh Israeli measures is because of the violence that emanates. 2,500 Jews were killed in the Second Intifada before this wall by suicide bombers that would go to the markets of Tel Aviv and blow themselves up. Now, of course, Palestinians would say the reason for that is the Israeli occupation. The Israelis would say the reason for the occupation is that we were attacked 3 times through this territory. So, there has to be a different kind of solution, and I don't think labeling Israel as an apartheid state moves us in that.
But you did mention that 20% of Israeli citizens here are Palestinians, and they feel like they're second-class citizens. So why are those? Aren't those are the part of the apartheid attribute to how they feel?
Legally and politically, there's total equality. But an Israeli employer, given a choice between an Israeli and a Palestinian, might choose to employ the Palestinian, or he might employ the Israeli, but he could easily choose to employ the Palestinian. But probably most would choose the Israeli. So it's that kind of issue. It might be equivalent to blacks in America today, where they feel where there's total equality before the law and politically, but they may feel like there's discrimination from individuals to individuals. But it's not a systematic political discrimination. So that's kind of the situation there. It's not a systematic political or legal separation, but it's individuals who have hard feelings, towards Palestinians because their child in the IDF was, a Molotov cocktail was thrown at him by a Palestinian. So you get those kind of things.
In your own personal journey, it sounds like you've traveled a bunch of places. Are there things that you learned in this recent experience in Israel that sort of stand out?
Well, that's a great question.
Could you repeat it?
The question is, in kind of the global scope of things, what are some of the lessons to be learned in Israel that maybe have some broader application? Or perhaps the other way around, what are some of the broader application things that might be brought to bear on Israel? This particular education was an international law. So I was talking about things like the Geneva Conventions, like the Refugee Convention, like the International Criminal Court, like the Human Rights Treaties, which are binding on those that have signed them. In some cases, they're binding on people, whether like the Convention Against Torture is binding on a nation, whether they've signed it or not. So you have this international legal regime, which kind of talks about how the world ought to operate. And that includes international humanitarian law, which is the law of occupation. That's the Geneva Conventions and the security programs. So all of these things have a lot to say about how to treat people. And for the most part, I would say 90% Israel complies with these things. Unlike groups like ISIS, which have no compulsion whatsoever about violating any international norm because they don't recognize anything. Places like Burma, you know, where everybody had hope in this new leadership in Burma, and yet the treatment of Burmese Muslims hasn't changed. So international law is useful as an ideological benchmark. The problem is there's no real way to get people to comply with it if they don't want to. There are some methods. There's sanctions and whatever. So Russia, when it occupied and annexed Crimea, against every norm of international law, sanctions were applied. Has it changed anything in Crimea? Not in the least. So one of the answers to that question is the idealism of international law is not matched by reality on the ground because of lack of enforcement capacity in the international arena to that may not be the answer you open the door, but it's one of them.
One more question, and I think we should wrap up.
Okay,
Thank you so much. If he's available afterwards, attack him.
Yeah. But make sure you're in compliance with international
One more question?
I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Well, go ahead. Everybody's getting
Well,
out.
I'm just wondering how the Orthodox Jews do contribute to their society or to the country, and at some point in the future, is it possible they would lose all of the benefits they've had and be asked? Because if their population is growing that fast, I can see where.
The government only has so much capacity to subsidize.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think that, yes, they will lose their benefits, but at least their financial benefits, but how do you stop people from voting? And so if you're voting, you know, if you become from 5% to 20% of the electoral population and you're voting in your party who are going to vote for your subsidies, you know, it becomes a very difficult thing. How are they contributing to society? They will say that the study of Torah, all these hundreds of thousands of young men studying Torah, is a means of keeping Jewish history and tradition and culture and religion alive. Others will say, that's your particular take on religion. And it's an extreme one, where women are separated. In the ultra-Orthodox communities, women can't walk down the streets, the same streets as men. Women sit in the back of the bus. It's just crazy, man. And most of the Israeli population just don't go there. But because they are growing and because they are subsidized, they have voice and power. I think that dynamic has to change. How exactly, I'm not too sure.
Okay.